I'll go ahead and start. I think something that really stood out to me in this week's readings is the power of questions, and especially the power of students kind of creating their own questions as they learn and experience something new. I really enjoyed the piece in the part in Eleanor. Actually in Neil Postman's and Charles Weingartner's writing, where they were talking about the class, where the teacher, had the three statements about it is right for men to give a woman a seat on a bus, it is right for children to be vaccinated against polio, and it's right for citizens to vote, and how this, whole discussion kind of like flourished out of just the students' kind of statements and questions. And they delved into what does it mean to be right, what is well educated, what is accepted, and the whole focus of the lesson became kind of like what the students were saying and their questions in reaction to what they were saying as well. So just how much learning can happen when you just let students kind of guide the learning and guide the lesson.
Yeah, that particular portion struck out to me too, and having like been an educator, it's funny how like this kind of inquiry-based learning approach has kind of been pushed as like, cutting edge, and this is how children are going to learn. But like this was written in like 1968, one. And two, like also now it's like, even though they're trying to go in this direction after how many decades, it's still forced, because in the conversation that you described, it didn't seem like the teacher had any type of objective to learning, but just to learn, just ask questions and then see what learning comes out of it. But like with the inquiry-based learning that is being pushed like in education, it's kind of like you have a point and like you're crafting questions to lead the student mind to a place that you want them to be, which is kind of what this reading was kind of cautioning about, like teaching them what instead of like letting them kind of discover. So I guess what struck me is just that, like, though this was written decades ago, people are still trying to make strides toward this like learning, and are still like missing the point of the kind of inquiry-based style.
And I definitely agree with George. It was, as I was reading through both of them, one was written in 1969, I believe, and the other one was 72. And I'm like, wow, we have not come very far, and maybe farther away from some of those theories and practices. And coming from theory of knowledge, teaching theory of knowledge for years, I could run a class on 3 questions, and it was, awesome to see, what the students were able to bring to the class with just a few questions. But yes, it was very frustrating, and I thought about inquiry and how it is pushed, but a lot of times when inquiry-based lessons, units, approaches often happen, they're very kind of superficial, where you just slap on the label of inquiry, where it's just your traditional lesson, but you just say, oh, it's inquiry because I asked a question, but it's more than that. So, but yeah, it was very frustrating to see that all of these amazing, wonderful ideas, starting in the 60s and 70s, and how much more they could have been improved and implemented in our education system, but it's just not. There are pockets in lots of schools that do authentic inquiry-based instruction, but they're very few and far between.
I totally agree with both of y'all. This kind of resonates with me in two different, or I guess I have two kind of ways that I've been thinking about the specific implementation of kind of inquiry-based stuff in my experience as an educator, and also what I'm literally doing this weekend. And then also about, and like I have one kind of, I have many questions, but one of my questions. So first, I'm just thinking about, so I'm a science teacher by training, right? And so we do a lot. There's this really, really big emphasis on inquiry-based learning in science, but I feel like depending on when you're in a discipline kind of based environment, right? When you think about academic disciplines, like in science, there is, oh my gosh, I would love to meet your dog, Francisco. But so like the inquiry based in science is thinking about how do we kind of get to a certain understanding, which is right, like the idea of science as a practice is gathering evidence to see patterns and to kind of figure out explanations of things, and you kind of keep on leveling up your understanding as you gain more evidence, theoretically, right? Like as if you think about the kind of the history of the understanding of the solar system and the universe, and thinking about how like what we thought gravity was isn't what gravity really is as far as we know now, but like in 30 years we could have some other groundbreaking thing that's going to change it. So it's interesting to think about how as a science, like in a science classroom that's specifically driven around science, like how inquiry is absolutely, it is like so encouraged, and it is about student questions, but it's how you get them to the same conclusions almost every time, right? Because that is what scientific understanding is kind of philosophically meant to be, I think. And I was also just thinking about this too, and kind of the ways that we think about like what the role of the educator is in this context of inquiry, and kind of what they were really asserting is like, it's really having the teacher as a facilitator and the teacher as, or they're really, like, they're not the expert in the room, right? It's like, I think that's kind of decentering the teacher as expert and really kind of moving that over is important. So this weekend, I'm a Zoom room monitor for some sessions for this thing called Learning in the Brain. And the theme of this conference is about like emotion and like social emotional learning in COVID. And a lot of it talks about how to do that in a hybrid or in a remote setting. And one speaker yesterday was talking about how if you were looking at social emotional learning, how you can either kind of be the emotions scientist, where you're looking to discover and observe and kind of find patterns. And when you're looking at someone, you're like looking as a scientist to figure out like what's really going on here. Or you can go in as like an emotions knower, right? Where you know the things and you're like, why are you so angry? And it's like you're kind of pushing that thing. So it's an interesting spot to think about.
I also really like the description of the teachers guiding students to examine the idea of right in the article. I note down a piece that I find very interesting. The author says the subject matter of the lesson was the responses of the learners to the questions they confront. I feel like that's a very different idea. Just like I feel the reason that they're able to do that class, I feel it's more like the teachers do not have like a preconceived content that they need to deliver, and they're able to kind of give students the freedom to do that, like, and just follow the students' ideas and pushing them to expand their notions, like their definitions, kind of like elicit their definitions of what means right, and then push them to clarify and examine their definitions. I feel that's very powerful, but I also feel like I don't know how to do that, like in classrooms where like I go in with my mission, like I have to make sure they understand this, all this content. And I just feel like on one hand, I feel like this is really powerful because I had one of my most powerful conversations in college are actually conversations with professors that they don't really have, they're not lecturing, they just ask me what do I think, and then they keep asking questions to push me to examine my own responses to the question that I ask. But then on the other hand, I feel like I don't know how to do that, like when I have like kind of have like an idea of like I really need to make sure they can understand these parts of the content. So I do want to ask other those who have teaching experiences, like how do, like I also kind of feel like the superficial of like using inquiry-based education, like how it's just like asking questions and then the format looks like inquiry-based, but it's not really like the conversations describing the article, that you are really trying to build a bridge between what the students think and kind of like lead them to like a better like way of thinking. So I'm just like curious, like how do you like do this like in classrooms? Like how do you let go of the mission of like covering certain like content?
Yeah, I felt that tension too. And like, honestly, in the current way that like education is set up, at least in this country, there's no way, because you come in, you have like, I'm just thinking from like having been a math teacher, like you're coming in, you have these standards to teach, right? And you have to, there's a certain place where a 5th or 6th grader just needs to be by the end of the year. And so like to approach it, that's why I was like, can you imagine to approach it just being like, all right, hey, questions just all year? I couldn't like imagine being trained the way I was trained to like get people to learn how to divide fractions by asking questions, right? And like, honestly, there's a way, right? But I think it's not necessarily laziness, but like, I think it ties to last week's reading, like kind of about fear. Because like, honestly, there's a way to approach like crafting questions, but like also that just means that you're trying to get to a specific answer by crafting questions to try to teach them fractions. With this approach, just to be like asking questions just for the sake of learning, I don't see how it would fit in the current educational landscape, and that we have to learn these things by this time to be competitive on world landscape. And like, it just seems like a bigger mission that like doesn't allow for discovery through questions. But at the same time, everybody, like most people that you'll talk to will tell you that the things that they remember about like, especially middle and elementary schools, aren't necessarily things that they learned, but like experiences and like how those teachers made them feel. And so like, obviously there's room to explore like how to leverage that. But I just think that the fear of falling behind through exploring something like that keeps anybody from exploring inquiry style learning and with that much I don't know, excitement.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think standards make it so difficult, but I think, even for math, especially, and for other subjects, I think sometimes when you focus on the quality of what you're doing and the conversations that you're having over the quantity, then that can allow for some of these opportunities for more critical thinking. Just in math, I was guilty of it when I was a math teacher, but giving 15, 20 math problems in a night for homework, instead of saying, hey, we're going to focus on these like 3 to 5 math problems, right? But I want you to devise kind of like multiple approaches, multiple strategies to kind of solve each problem. And, in class, if you kind of like had it really be more of an inquiry-based style where you're discussing with your classmates, kind of devising different strategies, thinking about potential, problems when you're tackling a problem, that there's so much more kind of like profound learning and thinking that happens in that space than when you try to, cover more questions.
Yeah, I feel like inquiry isn't something, especially in a like a STEM setting, that can exist by itself, right? Like you can't just like, I feel like you have to kind of balance it with maybe not like, I think, and I'm not saying about like pedagogical styles, right? I'm just thinking about like activity wise, because the other thing too, right? Like the classroom environment that we saw, I think, I'm not sure what time of year like the classrooms that we saw were there, right? Because like in order to have those kinds of conversations, you have to facilitate and build trust. And like right now, like I'm working with 5 students who have so much anxiety being in a classroom because of who they are and because of what their past academic experiences have been and educational experiences have been, that like a verbal conversation like this isn't a way to engage in something for them. Right. So it's about knowing who your students are, but and also making sure that you have that time to build up to something like this, because like for someone to come into somewhere where they don't know anyone, they don't know anything, and like to share what their idea of what it means to be right is like, it takes a lot of confidence. You have to be really kind of ready and willing and vulnerable to do that. So we have to think about like how to scaffold that. And also think about how like there are other activities and like kind of tangible things. And when you do think more about like the pedagogical tools of inquiry and like how do you facilitate, right? Like how do you make sure that in order to kind of gain this really deep understanding and this deep critical thinking, this way of critical thinking, you have to kind of, I don't know, I feel like you have to be able to do other things other than just like sit and talk about the answers to questions. You have to have hands-on stuff, right? It's just like there are a lot of other things where this couldn't be the entire school year every single day. It also makes me think about, oh, sorry, go for it.
No, please, absolutely. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just thinking too about like when you're making curricular choices and when you're thinking about standards, and it's like, if we could be more intentional about choosing what like topics we're covering or uncovering, right? It would, and making sure that we're choosing topics that can also facilitate transfer to other things, right? So if you learn how to learn about something, how to think deeply about something, then think critically about one thing, how can you transfer those methods into something that is similar or not similar?
Wow. So you just talked about something that I really try to focus on as an educator. And I've talked about it with some other group members in here. Rebecca, you talked about spiralizing content. So it's like you're covering the same concepts or very similar concepts in different manners. So it's hands-on approach. Maybe it's problem solving. Maybe it's an essay. Maybe it's a puzzle. But you're constantly coming around in different manners to the same content, and I think that does foster that creative thinking. And so it can be done, but again, so frustrating when we exist in a education system where the standards and the expectations that are established are not necessarily archaic, but just they're measuring the wrong standards. And it's very frustrating. You talk about your kids, and I have kids as well, who struggle. They flourish in other ways. So, and then there's almost this blaming the victim type thing where we're blaming the kids for falling into these opportunity gaps or these gaps by the system that created the gaps. So it's, we don't have the flexibility and freedom to necessarily spend all of our time doing this amazing work when we're victims ourselves of these impossible standards or standards of inequities.
I also have another kind of question in terms of like what students, like where students are currently at and where I want them, I hope that they can be able to get to, because like in the second article, the author also mentions that like they don't think the child's like they says like all these questions have to be relevant, be perceived as relevant by the learners in order for them to be like effective questions, but then they also say like the child's perception of what is relevant can be changed, and one of the benefits of like the effects of the class is to extend the child's perception of what is relevant and what is not. But I'm not sure like how to balance like whether I'm like extending their perception of the questions they're interested in, or like I'm imposing the questions that I think are important onto them. Because I'm currently doing like another project for like a project on kind of like identity exploration, and I really want to like I feel the idea of like identity development is very interesting, but then my partner also mentions that like my project partner also mentions that like how like many high school students may not see it as like relevant because they want something that's more immediately like helpful in terms of improving their grades, and things like a more long term and may not resonate with them. But then like I feel like this is important, but then I also don't know like it like from the surface it looks like it doesn't seem like they don't really think this is the relevant questions to their current learning. So I'm like kind of like very like in this kind of like torn between like am I like just like extending their concern, like their in like the questions that they see as relevant, or I'm like imposing the questions that I see as important onto them.
Yeah, that stood out to me too, and it kind of made me think about like the importance of learning communities, because they just afford the learner different perspectives. Because like honestly, them the reading pointed to like, oh, kind of build on students' interest, or like yes, absolutely build on students' interest, but at the same time, it's the exposure kind of creates the interest. And so it is kind of like it is kind of it's kind of creating the interest for them in a way, just because it's a balance of creating interest for them while also like building upon their interest. Because like students don't necessarily students learn from experience. Like their interests don't just like come intrinsically and like bloom like a flower. Like they're learning from home, they're learning from what they've seen. And like there's times where like they might encounter something that is interesting, that they find out that they're interested in, that they didn't know. And so that just made me think of the importance of learning communities and them just being afforded a range of different perspectives, just so that like you are building on their interests, but also exposing them to new interests. Because I do think that it is it is a balance. When you're just looking to only appeal to student interest, and I feel like you're also limiting them to seeing what else they could be interested in.
George, just to follow up to that point, Eleanor Duckworth had a quote that the right question at the right time can move children to peaks in their thinking, and children can raise the right question for themselves when the setting is right, allowing themselves to work towards an answer, right? So the point, like a teacher can help like generate that initial interest and passion and inquisitiveness, but then it's really helpful when the student is raising their own questions related to the topic, right? And they're gonna be so much more driven to explore that topic if they're raising their own questions, right? And it made me think of that experiment that they did in that reading where they presented two groups of students with all these different, materials. And the one group of student who was used to kind of this more like exploratory process, inquisitive process of learning, they were constantly just kind of like tinkering with the things that they had, coming up with new questions and wonderings about how they worked and how they could work. So I think it's, part of the teacher's role and purpose is to help students develop an interest, but then let students kind of like take it from there.
I think too, kind of again, how accomplishing that really still like is based in trust, right, and establishing trust, because students, sometimes they have questions and they're really trusting and they're just like, I'm just going to go for it. And other times, in order to figure out like what their questions are, they either have to trust you to give them good resources, or they, for what it depends on. I think it just, I don't know. It just all depends on trust.
I'm thinking of this mainly because I also had an interview with a high school teacher, and then I think she has a very good idea in terms of like how she kind of has an approach that emphasizes students' interests and also help like that they figure out the city that they want to go to as a key part of their as a key part of the plan students come up with about their future. But I also feel like so it's like she has this idea, which I think is kind of nice compared to education that focuses only on students' current grades. But I also feel this kind of like her idea is very kind of like accepted by all the students. Like every student has an idea about the city that they want to go to. But then I'm like also thinking, I don't want my student just be like multiple of me, like just to become someone like accepting all my ideas. And like because the idea of like finding out the city that you want to go to is the key of your future planning for like a high school student's plan for future. I feel that idea can be a valuable perspective, but I also feel that shouldn't be the only approach that students plan their future. But the fact that like that idea just becomes the focus of every student in that class's planning, that also kind of makes me feel a little bit terrified in terms of like just like how it's nice that she implement the idea of planning future into her students' mind, but it's also terrifying for me that like now all her students think of cities, like her approach in their planning of future, and no one proposes like any other different like perspective. and also like she and her students definitely have a very good relationships. Like she totally respects her students' interests, but she would just like ask the students to figure out like the city that you want to go to, and the universities that are in that city that you can apply to. So I just feel a little bit like having like a mixed feeling about this kind of like teacher-student relationship, that like there is a lot of trust, but it also makes me feel like, I feel like the students shouldn't, I want the students to challenge the teachers, you know, like I feel like I don't want to just like generate multiple replicas of myself.
I get.
Oh,
Sorry. Go ahead. No, I was gonna say I get that, but I guess it's just trying to figure out like where to start. Like, do you just, because like you said, like there is a certain work that needs to be done on relationship building to be able to have these conversations, and like in relationship building, like kind of like stating opinions, like building. And so it's like, where do you start with the questioning so that like you're able to allow students to like explore and learn as authentically as possible, while still like imparting some of your ideas too, because like learning is kind of about an exchange of ideas. And yes, you want the students to like come to their own conclusions and develop their own interests. But I don't know. I recognize the teacher's place as like a facilitator, but at the same time, it does seem like there has to be some sort of give for that relationship to work. You know.
thank you for sharing that. And I'm just gonna say, like, we don't have to focus on this one question. Like, if you have anything else you want to share about the two readings, we can move on.
Yeah, so I did have a question for the group and see what you guys think. There was this one particular part in Duckworth's reading where, so I'm trying to find it. So basically, knowing enough about things is a prerequisite for wonderful ideas. And yeah, I get where, you know, maybe some part of me does agree with that, but other parts, you know, not knowing enough about things can also generate wonderful ideas as well. So it's I don't think that there has to be this prerequisite of knowing enough about a certain structure, concept, schema, you know, law, you know. So I don't know what you guys think about that.
I definitely agree about the idea that like you don't have to know a lot about something to have good ideas. I think that is a very, very important sentiment. And it, I don't know, it just kind of makes me think about, right, like when you think about the question, which is, you know, Postman and Weingartner's like title of this chapter, it's what's worth knowing. I think it's like kind of the ideas I got about it are like according to whom, right? So it's, you know, and when do you want to learn them and how are you going to learn them? And also, I think the other part of this question is thinking about like what's worth caring about. Right? Because the other thing I think that's this space I think it kind of goes between the you don't have to know a lot about something to have good ideas about it and to care about it. And often it's like that caring about it that like facilitates getting more information and more knowledge around something. And also thinking too about like not creating, you know, little like replicas of yourself. It's thinking about like, what do you as an educator, like, what do you care about? How does that kind of inform your practice? How does your practice inform what you care about? And also, how do you make sure that like there are some things that are important to care about, and how do you instill that in students, right? Like it is important that my students know how to care for themselves and care for other people and think and respect that like other people are people and they like also have good ideas, right? And so it's like, how do you facilitate that perspective taking and how do you make sure that they have enough information to understand, like, you know, where, like, why things are the way that they are now, and also how they can be going forward, right? How do you get them to kind of generate those ideas? I'm thinking very specifically with regards to systems of oppression, especially in the US, right? Like, in my classroom, we talk a lot about, like, every year I've done a unit where we watch Hidden Figures, and we talk about the fact that it's like, why did it take 50 years for this movie to come out? Because I have ninth graders in physics. And then we talk about, like, okay, who are other hidden figures of science? What are the other socio-political factors that, like, are kind of and creating these different, like, hidden narratives of important, like, people in the scientific community and in the scientific world? And, like, why is it important? Like, I think it's important for them to know about, because I also think what that does is it acknowledges that, like, the disciplinary parts of what we're learning and what we're knowing and, like, information we're kind of giving them access to is something that I think it goes across all of the disciplines that we've separated it into in most current education systems, right? I think, and it's like, it's that interdisciplinary, but really it's like a broad reaching thing where we see the intersections of different parts of our societies coming together when we're trying to encourage students to care about things that matter, because they matter to not only us, but they matter within our culture, they matter within our communities, they matter within the world, and they matter to other people too.
Mary, I think to your question of, like, what actually matters and, like, what should we care about, like, I think that something that really stood out to me in the readings was, like, how democratic education would be if we set, like, if this was our approach to curriculum. Like, what matters is, like, what matters to the kids that we're teaching, like, and to the community and to their parents and to, like, the people. And, like, right now, like, we prescribe kind of, like, as you were saying, like, that the STAR test and what's on the STAR test should matter. And, like, I don't know about you guys, but, like, when I was, like, looking at the GRE and stuff, like, I feel like the STAR test is harder and more confusing than, like, the GRE. Like, there are often questions on the STAR test where I'm like, what really could be A or B, and I could make an argument for either one. Like, and so I don't know what we're preparing them for with that. Like, I don't know if it's college, and, like, because I don't feel like anything on the STAR test prepared me for where I am now. And, like, or is it preparing them for careers? Because, like, I don't know what career I don't know what we're prescribing for them. So, like, how cool if we said to, like, the people that we're teaching, like, what matters to you guys? Like, you know, what do you guys value? Like, how much more democratic education would actually be than just, like, saying the STAR test matters and, like, and then having no buy-in and no engagement. And it just, I don't know. I think that's what, like, really stood out to me is, like, we've gotten so far away from truly, like, education, like, for and by the people, like a democratic education, you know?
Rebecca, just a quick question. Are you in Texas?
I am in Texas. Are you in Texas also?
No,
and
but I
do you go by Mary Frances, or
I do go by Mary
just
Frances, yeah.
Mary Frances? Nice.
But yes, I'm from Texas, so I was just like, oh, I'm very familiar with STAR tests.
Yes. Cisco and I are both from Texas and STAR, or not from. I live in Texas. I'm not from Texas, but we're yeah, teaching with STAR tests and stuff. And I also teach freshmen, Mary Frances, just like you.
Rebecca, to your point about what you said, no, don't leave me. I had a thought. It's gone. Sorry.
When it comes back, George, just interrupt. Especially if I'm speaking, just go for it. Be like, Mary Frances, shut up. I have my thought is back. I'm ready.
I remember it. Yeah. So this reminded me of like what you just said, reminded me of kind of what these readings are blurring together, but I have these ideas in my head and just like, I know it's from a reading, it's not mine. About gosh, what was it? because you were, oh yes, about like kind of how society kind of dictates what it is that is important to learn, right? And depending on where you are, like they put their importance on like the tone of what is important, and it kind of is the opposite of what you're saying. That it should be democratic. We should be kind of asking like what is important to learn, but because of depending on where we live, the importance of what is like the stress on what is important is based on like wherever it is. That STAR test could be just like, hey, people who pass the STAR test at this level usually end up going here, and so like they've just decided like what's important, and after a certain point, it does separate. It just becomes codified in like what people are doing and what you're supposed to do. That kind of just loses meaning. It's just like something you're supposed to do, and a lot of things just become systemized like that, like with the QWERTY thing. Like right now, like it doesn't make sense for it to be that way, but because it's been that way for so long, it's just so difficult to change and pivot because it's been totally socially accepted. I hope that makes sense.
Mary Frances, what are your thoughts on the STAR? Are you in Texas now?
I am not in Texas now. No. I actually haven't been in Texas since I graduated from high school.
Okay,
gotcha. In Dallas. I taught in the Middle East for my first year out of college, and then I've been in Virginia for the past couple of years. Gotcha. And now I'm living in Boston. So I'm just kind of been all over the place. Yeah. But I think, I mean, first of all, right, obviously this style of teaching that we talked about with this inquiry-based and really question asking, I think one thing that's kind of been underlying a lot of what we talked about is like current systems of assessment are quite frankly crap. And they don't like what the assessment is trying to figure out is like, what do you know? And not like, how do you know how to know more things? Right. Like, how do you learn? How do you gain a better perspective or a more holistic or whatever perspective on the things that you care about, and as you start to care about and become interested in more things, how can you apply those to whatever you're going into, right? So that makes me think about when we think about like pedagogy, and obviously like, yeah, so I think, I mean, like I have a lot of feelings about state assessments. I have a lot of feelings about like the SAT and the GRE and standardized assessments in general. But I also am thinking too about like, when we think about 21st century skills, and I had a conversation with my advisor about this on Friday afternoon, right? If we think about how there's this emphasis right now on making sure that you're like, that a lot of pedagogy and a lot of teaching incorporates 21st century skills, and it's like what, creativity, collaboration, I don't remember the others, but it's like the 4 C's. One of the things that I think is kind of neglected within that, or I guess it's not necessarily neglected, I don't know if that's the right word, but it's this idea that like what we need to be able to teach our students to do is how to be proactive. We need to teach our students how to be proactive while simultaneously managing, yes, thank you, they're in the chat, but it's like while simultaneously managing the reactive things that we have to do to take care of like what has been historically problematic, and also to create structures that and we go forward can also work and be adaptive and adapted, right? I think that like the idea of evolution and adaptation is something that we all kind of like everybody needs, but without knowing what that's going to look like going forward, it's really hard to plan for. So I'd love to hear what y'all think about like ways to kind of instill proactive learning strategies in a curriculum.
I don't have many answers to that question because I have very limited teaching experience, but I just want to add that one thing that I really emphasize, I really value, I find very valuable as a student is self-directed learning. Like I feel like ultimately, it's not just like I feel like for the students, like I feel the most important thing is not really what I learn in class, but that like they inspire me to take more initiatives in learning outside of the class. So like I feel like for me, like self-directed learning is more important. Like having this kind of abilities to be able to learn like in this self-directed manner is more important than any knowledge I learned in high school, like in my Chinese high schools. So I just want to echo that. I'm very curious about that as well, and I want to hear from like the folks who have experiences with classroom teaching and how you try to do foster that in classrooms.
So I think the way that that I was able to really foster that was making real world connections in an authentic way to making it relevant, watching the news regularly in class and connecting your content to what was in that news story. Have the students bring in different problems that they see in news or anything that they find interesting. So I would always start off my class with, anybody have anything to share that, you know, maybe a Netflix series they're watching, a song that they just listened to, you know, whether they, you know, heard a new joke. So we always keep it really relevant, so they have a voice. And then from there, then we kind of decide how we can connect it to whether something in biology, chemistry, you know, history, and then really try not to make it like the different subjects are in silos. So just make it really cohesive to the whole school. So, you know, you don't want to think about something that you learn in biology and then you're done learning about biology when you go to art. It's just a continuum. I know I said a lot, but basically keeping it relevant, with real world connections, something that the kids find interesting, because if they don't find it interesting, then it's going to be really hard for them to really care about it, and to connect it to their content, because there's lots of things that we care about and we think that are super dope, but when we bring it to school, it's just like, you know, just kind of, you know, falls flat. So hopefully that helps. And I do have lots of ideas on how to connect it. You know, whether it's watching CNN 10 in the morning and, you know, at the beginning of class, and then connecting it to different content areas. And I have lots of activities and ways to do that. So please reach out to me, guys, if you ever need, you know, a thought partner or want to see how that works.
Thanks, Cisco. And just building on that, I think ethnic studies is a great model of a course that is proactive, authentic, relevant to students' lives, and, you know, really help students understand kind of the systemic issues that are going on, you know, in the country, in the world, and empowers them to do something about that. And I feel like a lot of other subjects don't really allow for that kind of thoughtfulness, critical thinking, and action. But I'm taking ethnic studies in education with Dr. B right now, and such a powerful course. And I think so powerful for young students to engage in from, you know, elementary, middle school years, and just really should be a model for how we teach our other courses as well.
That's so interesting that you said that, Connor, because I watched like an interview or like a webinar, I don't know exactly what it was, with Dr. V. It was for my Making Caring Common class. And she was talking about how curriculum should never be, like, no one should ever be making curriculum over the summer. Like, curriculum should be made like throughout the year, like while you have your students. It should be like, there should be thousands of iterations of it as you're like developing it. And I thought of her and her statement about that as I was reading this week, you know, like, I think, but I'm always also trying to think of like how I can use all this amazing like stuff we're learning in the current like structure of my classroom. But the more that I learn, the more I realize everything needs to be just thrown away. Like, I don't know that, like, I don't know. I don't even, yeah. I don't know how to do that, I guess, is what I'm saying, given the current like structures that we have. And even though I try to afford my students so much agency, like with their independent reading books instead of me giving them a whole class text or whatever, like I just feel like they're still like, I'm still driving the objectives like home that I want them to be looking for. And you know, like it's still really me directed and stuff. I don't know. I could see, I'm not taking her to class, but I could really see how what you're saying, how like yeah, based on what she said in the webinar, that like that's how she, yeah, runs her class and stuff.
I definitely want to agree with that. I concur with Connor. It's just such a amazing course, super powerful, very relevant, and I'm just so lucky to take T550 and T004, because it's all about, you know, agency, and it's about change, but in different methods. So it's amazing. So I definitely recommend everyone to take T004, Ethnic Studies with Dr. V. You know, it will definitely leave an impact on you.
I think this may be a place to end. If any last comment anyone would like to mention?
I had one question, which is like something that I've been thinking of based on who's in my classroom this year too, which is thinking about how on a logistical level this works with, again, students who are like mostly neuroatypical, how this works with students who have a lot of anxiety and distrust of education and of educational systems. And just like I'm thinking about for the kids who don't see you, George, thank you. It was nice to meet you. But like thinking about students who do not identify as, either they don't identify as being engaged in a broader community because of COVID or because of whatever else, right? Or they actively are like, I don't, or it's either they aren't participating in it or they just don't. I guess it's just, I don't know. I think when it's like when the kids that are neuroatypical, the kids that are not at a place in their development where like perspective taking is fully developed, and thinking about or if they're just not at a place where they feel like comfortable sharing their personal experiences and their personal thoughts, right? Because of anxiety or whatever else, like when they're not comfortable sharing them with you as their teacher or with their peers, like how else do you facilitate this? Which is a very long discussion. So maybe not a right now thing, but it's been kind of marinating.
It's interesting that you asked that, Mary Frances, because I think one of the first questions in their list of questions was like something about anxiety. That was like, what are anxieties? Like, what causes anxieties? And I was like, when you were speaking about students that struggle with that kind of stuff, like, I wonder if it didn't have to be like a public exploration for them, but if this could be like things that they journal on occasionally over time that evolve, you know what I mean? And like, just to develop self-awareness. Like, I don't ever read my students' journals unless they specifically ask me to, because I really want to create this space of like, this is for me. Like, I'm learning about me and letting myself be me. So I don't know, like, that was one of the first questions that they posed. And I was like, that's a really poignant question, because our students really struggle. And I struggle with anxiety, but our students really do. And I don't think they talk about it a lot, you know? So I wonder if that could be a way.
I really love those questions in the second article that starts with like, what do you worry about most? What are the causes of your worries? And if your worries be eliminated, how? I really like those questions, because I feel like I really feel these questions can be like I don't know if you've heard of like the self-analysis, like psychoanalysis, and I feel like it's very helpful when teachers like when like I am having a class and I actually have some problem with like I don't know if it's appropriate for me to avoid any of my some of my questions, and I was talking to the professor and then he was like asking me like and my classmate also, like I had conversation with like both of them, and then they're asking me like, what is your fear, what prevents you from like voicing those questions, and really help me get down to where my fear is at and like what's the causes of my fear, and really to tackle that and like the causes of my fear like one by one. And I just feel that's a very interesting conversation, like not in public but like private conversations I have, like not only helps with like me getting like like trying to contribute my question my opinions in class, but also help me understand myself more. And I actually am taking this approach with my parents too, like, because my parents have a lot of prejudices, and I have always been like, I want them to kind of like change their prejudices about certain groups of people, but I feel like it's hard to do that. And I just feel this approach of like asking questions and help them to now analyze themselves to be a very powerful tool. Go ahead.
Gabby, in making Caring Common, Dr. Weisberg's class, we've been reading about like how to have conversations with like people with different like prejudices, especially in America during like the election season and stuff, like in your place of work or in your families and stuff, and how to like have those conversations civilly. You know what I mean? Like how to really exist in a pluralistic society and not hate one another because you can't, like, I don't know. But it's interesting that you brought up those questions, because I feel like that's been a space that like we as adults are really bad at, and that came out really clearly during this like election season. Like we're really bad at having conversations when someone is like prejudiced one way or has a different opinion than us. Like how do we, you know what I mean, what does that look like to have those conversations? And it's an important skill for us to learn as adults, and like also to really teach our kids too. But we can't model it and teach it to our kids if we're not good at it, you know. Like it really starts with us, you know.
Yeah, that makes me think a lot about like the idea too of when you, and this is something that was really came up a lot on my like social media for a while, which was the idea of like, especially over the summer, I was thinking about like how to normalize changing your mind when you're like, you have access to new information, right? And like, again, changing your understanding of things and making sure that you are open to doing that. But at the same time, what I don't think, and this kind of was what Rebecca was saying, is like, I don't think that we're necessarily that good at like, when people access that new information and then don't change their mind, or they're like, okay, yeah, but this just like, or if, you know, and I'm personally not very good at it. The idea of like, it's like, but I've presented this new information to you and you aren't changing your mind the way that I expected you to be, or the way that I hoped you would be. And I just don't know really where to go with that sometimes. And it's something that I know I am working on a lot. And I think that's kind of one of those things where it's like, it's like that kind of, I don't know if it's humbling or like, I mean, it's definitely, it can be humbling, but it's like, it's that moment where like what else, what's next?
I love that you're asking those questions. Like the articles were always like about how we can teach kids to this. And the whole time this week that I was reading those, I was like, I am bad at this. Like I am not in a place where I can model this and teach kids how to do this well, because I don't think I've ever been trained on this. Like this was never like, you know, and I just, yeah, so it's just, that's really, you're right, it's like really humbling, and we need to take a really honest look at ourselves at like what that critical discourse can and should look like. And when I think about our kids being the future, it's like, oh my gosh, like if we, this generation that's voting, we're so lacking in these capacities, like where will our teens and our elementary school kids be in 15 years? You know, like if I don't know, like those are really important skills that I feel like teachers need to be trained on, adults, people need to be trained on, so that we can really like help our kids develop those.
I just wanted to mention something I read elsewhere. That's like my last comment. It's like something called like talked about like how like some people ask others like for like their genuine like authentic opinions, and then when the other side offered their genuine opinions, and then the person who asked for that said like, that's not what I meant. And I feel that's definitely the case with conversations both with students and with people I disagree with. Like as a student, like sometimes my teacher would ask like just let me know what you're really thinking about. But then when I offer the questions, I can tell from my teachers, like I can tell from their faces that they kind of saying like, that's not what I meant. And I just feel that's very like, like ironical in terms of like what people ask for and what they really want. And I feel like I definitely see the importance of like having experiences where like teachers, adults themselves are able to have those conversations, and then to be able to have those conversations with their students. I just feel it's really like we're like a mutual learning that like a symmetrical learning. Like I forgot the word. Like another course we're talking about how the education that teacher receives is symmetrical to the education they provide to their students. And I just feel this is very important if we really want to have like real, authentic, like a inquiry-based education.
I love what you said. I have to go, but I love it.
Yeah, I think it's good to end the conversation here, and we can, I'm just going to do this, like I will do this every week. So sometimes I forgot to announce it in the chat, but it will go on. Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you for joining me, for joining us. Like, Mary Frances, nice to see you.
Nice to meet you, Mary Frances.
You too.
Yeah.
You know,
Bye,
nice
you guys.
Slack or whatever, anytime.
Yeah.
Bye, y'all.
Bye. Bye, Debbie.